My guest today is Dr. Michelle Berrey.
It was one of the hardest times. We had the FBI come in. We were getting death threats. It was just heartbreaking.
What makes you decide that it's time to jump to something more entrepreneurial?
I really liked that opportunity to make a quick decision.
Something was going on here in the U.S. and they decided to go internationally.
Our stock fell 90%, so had to try to figure out whether to try again. What do statistics matter when you're talking about lives?
Over $11 billion. Did you want to sell? My guest today is Dr. Michelle Berrey. She's led the science at 3 biotech companies focused on antivirals and liver disease over the last 15 years. As Chief Medical Officer of Pharmasset, she led the clinical development of sofosbuvir, a cure for hepatitis C that Gilead acquired for $11.2 billion. At Chimerix, first as CMO and then CEO, she navigated a national media firestorm over compassionate use, the Ebola outbreak, and the surprising phase 3 failure of a drug nearly everyone expected to work. At Intercept Pharmaceuticals, she led the clinical team through a contentious advisory meeting and a second FDA rejection before the company was sold to Alfasigma. One experience was among the biggest successes in biotech. One was a surprising failure, and one was a challenge from start to finish. Not many executives have lived through that range, and Michelle talks about each of these chapters with candor. In our conversation, we go back to her training during the HIV crisis, where she learned to pay attention to the outliers. She walks through the perfect chemistry of sofosbuvir and wishes to some degree they hadn't sold the company so soon. Michelle talks about becoming CEO of Chimerix in 48 hours during a social media crisis, the 2 a.m. calls with the FDA, and what it takes not to define yourself by your most recent result. She built her relationship with the FDA over decades and has strong personal responsibility to the drugs and the patients. Michelle is now retired, but it's clear she still has a deep love of the science. No Spotlight Needed is proud to welcome Dr. Michelle Berrey. I'm so excited to have you here. There's a lot to get through. You have quite a history, and I think it's going to be really a great conversation.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm really honored.
Oh, as I look at your career, you were part of probably one of the most successful biotech stories of all time at Pharmasset. You were amidst a media frenzy and ultimately a disappointment at Chimerix, and then entered into a really challenging situation at Intercept Pharmaceuticals. So as you reflect on those 3 very different chapters of your career, what have you learned, or, what's driven you as you think about your career?
Well, I always knew I wanted to be a physician.
Mm-hmm.
So I always was driven to the science. Always loved learning, and that there's always more to learn. Mm-hmm. And I loved, once I got into infectious diseases, loved clinical trials and being part of that research environment. Thought I would stay in academics, and then found my way to Glaxo initially. Great learning environment, but was not something I wanted to do long term. Mm-hmm. The hierarchy, the decision-making through committee was frustrating for somebody who likes to make decisions and move on. So once I got to Pharmasset and realized that you could make a decision, be acting on it by that afternoon, no committees, just move on it, make a decision, good or bad, but that opened up opportunities for more decisions. There were disappointments there too. Biotech always is fraught with disappointments. 95% of drugs don't ever make it. So fail fast, figure out where the weaknesses are in the drug and kill it quickly so you spend the least amount of your resources and can move on to your next decisions. So even at Pharmasset, we had our initial drug was in hepatitis B. We got through our IPO that was our use of funds for that. We got the trial fully enrolled and then found a safety issue, actually not in our trial, but it was already on the market. So had to shut that down. That allowed us to focus, though, quickly onto hepatitis C. And that was our total focus from that moment forward. when you have limited funds and you really need to make those streamlined decisions, get to a decision, push the drug, see what it's going to do, and then move forward as quickly as you can.
So it sounds like fail fast, but focus at the same time.
Yes.
So you've set me up perfectly for kind of going through some of your history. So you talked about the early days of infectious diseases. You, MD, also a master's of public health as well. And you did your training at what you called UW, right? University of Washington.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about that time. And I was also told, and maybe it wasn't in Washington, but elsewhere, that this was the time of the HIV crisis.
Yes.
You would actually stand outside men's health clinics to try to talk to some of these men about the disease.
Actually, bathhouses.
They were bathhouses
at the time, right? So this was still in the 90s. We were still trying to understand more about transmission. So I was recruiting people who knew they were potentially being exposed to get them to come in and explain what they were doing, what their sex history was, where they had potentially been exposed to other viruses they may have been exposed to. Learned a lot. Opened my eyes quite a bit. I don't blush anymore. But we learned a lot about HIV transmission, and that if you could catch somebody in their first couple of days after infection and get them started on the new drugs that were emerging at the time, the protease inhibitors, in addition to the nucleosides, that you could actually preserve their immune system. So you didn't end up seeing a lot of those opportunistic infections.
Yeah.
So it was a great learning opportunity. Yes, it was still, unfortunately, in the middle of the AIDS crisis. We hadn't seen the benefits yet of the protease inhibitors, but it's also where I ran my first clinical trials.
Yeah.
Learning about that, had a wonderful PA who taught me the ins and outs of good clinical trials, and to always pay attention to the outliers. So
the ones that
Teresa Shea was amazing at that, and taught me a lot. Left there, went to GSK after a short time on faculty at the UW. It's a great institution. Something 50, I think, faculty members in infectious diseases. So one of the largest, if not the largest, infectious diseases division in the country. So tough to kind of get your foot in.
Yeah.
So it was a relatively easy decision to move to industry.
Yeah. So you did move to Glaxo, at now GlaxoSmithKline, but back then it was
Glaxo Welcome.
Glaxo Welcome. And you called it GW
University.
Right. So a different GW, I suppose.
Yeah.
So, talk to me a little bit about Big Pharma, clinical development, what you learned about clinical development at Big Pharma. I got to imagine this is where you got your feet wet. This is where you really dug your heels in. But what was the value of that experience as you went on to now saying you love failing fast?
Yes. So I started in their phase 3 group, so phase 3 and some of the post-marketing studies, so drugs that were already on the market. So you already had thousands of patients worth of data to look at. You knew they were safe. You were just getting a bigger and bigger database or exploring some of the populations that hadn't been studied in the initial trials that got them on the market. Enjoyed that, but as I did more of the early phase studies, really enjoyed that early translational medicine. Let's get it out of the animal studies and into humans as quickly as possible. Really push the drugs quickly to see what they could do. So I loved that early phase discovery, and that's what I was doing most of my time. At the end of my time at GSK, got good advice when I was there to use it, like GW University, do as many different projects as possible, as many different phases, marketing, public-private stuff, so doing work with different universities, the ACTG at the time, and to get in front of the FDA as much as you could.
So it gave you
to
a
really
lot of exposure.
Understand that interaction.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's great. You, at the time at Glaxo, so you spent 8 years there. At the same time, you were raising 2 kids as a single mom.
Yep.
And I got to imagine that was not easy. You're leaning into a career. You're trying to really build yourself, learn things. But you've got 2 young kids at home. What was that like?
Yeah. Well, it takes a village. So
It does.
As we know. So I had a wonderful nanny who'd moved with me from Seattle.
Really?
And
Amazing.
yeah, so she, we still stay in touch. My kids like to go visit her for sure.
That's great.
And then my ex-husband and then his wife got more involved as the kids got into school. And so, yeah, eventually there were 4 of us showing up for parent-teacher meetings. And but, yeah, it was always a challenge. But my kids got exposed to a lot of biotech and learned about doing post-IPO raises and what's on the cover. And, it was just funny dinner time questions.
Yeah.
So it was good. I loved that they watched me go through my career too. They got dragged to a lot of evening business dinners and learned to have conversations with adults. At a young age.
That's so great. Yeah, no, I always think, that we as working moms have to make sacrifices, but there's also a lot of benefit, to our kids when they watch you lean in.
Yeah, absolutely. There was never a question of not pursuing my career. And that was, but they were used to seeing me travel. They got pretty used to packing their own bags and learning how to travel and getting to tag along to some fun conferences.
That's good.
Too.
That's good. So it's now 2007, and what makes you decide that it's time to jump ship from the mothership, if you will, to something more entrepreneurial?
I really liked that opportunity to make a quick decision, move into the early clinical trials quickly. The committee meetings were driving me nuts. I do think that sort of that think 3 times before you make a decision at Big Pharma has crippled a lot of their early R&D. Mm-hmm. So we do see, I think, a lot of the risk-taking happening in biotechs or happening at universities and little spinoffs that then get picked up by Big Pharma once they've eliminated, de-risked some of those early trials.
So Pharmasset's, based in Princeton, you talked about earlier. So first, you come on as chief medical officer.
Yeah.
Did you think you were ready?
Yeah, it was actually a smaller portfolio than I had been overseeing at GSK, a smaller number of employees. So, and I didn't have to make PowerPoint slides for committee meetings all the time. So it was great. I actually had one of the other scientists that I worked really closely with for the last several years that I was at GSK came with me to Pharmasset. So Bill and I came as a package and worked very closely together. Loved it, never looked back.
So in 2007, Pharmasset goes public. And as you mentioned, the lead compound, the reason that you went public was this hepatitis B drug.
Yeah.
Now, this was a drug that was already on the market in Korea. But tell me what happened, and you had to make some big decisions.
So it was a nucleoside that had some questions about its safety earlier that felt like they had been addressed. We were working with the FDA to decide exactly how to frame up the phase 3 study. Eventually decided to do 1 study rather than 2.
Okay.
So a sort of supersized phase 3 that would answer all the questions. Yeah. So while we're enrolling this big international study and flying from Perth to Paris to Rio to keep the study going and getting sites up and running, we were also starting to get some safety reports from Korea. So we realized that this was a longer-term exposure problem, had to make the decision to shut down the trial literally the same week that we had finished enrollment.
Oh, my goodness.
Of the study that was the reason for the IPO. The use of proceeds for the IPO was this phase 3 study. So called the FDA, and they said, you don't have any safety issues in this country. We know, but we do see them in other countries. So we're gonna make this decision for ourselves. So we shut it down. Had to, that's a process that takes a few months too, but immediately shifted focus to our hepatitis C program.
Shutting down a program, that couldn't have been an easy decision. It couldn't have been a very popular decision.
Was not a popular decision for sure. But I think explaining it to the board and the opportunity that it gave us to, yes, we're not going to have a commercial income stream that was supposed to be funding our hepatitis C program. But at that time, hepatitis C was really starting to get some more attention in the markets, and the investor base was getting more interested in it. So we felt like that could help us balance out that risk.
Yeah. Well, but I got to imagine, just thinking about that Hep B program, like patient safety is number one.
Absolutely. And I think that was helpful to have that conversation with the FDA and for them to understand that was us making that decision, that we were the ones who were saying we're not willing to take this risk. No, we haven't seen those safety issues in our program.
Yeah.
But I'm not willing to wait until we see some of the longer term problems. It's time to cut our losses and pivot to Hep C.
Yeah. Now we know what the end story is on Hep C. It was an incredible drug, sabbatical. At what point in the development of that product did you feel that you had a blockbuster on your hand?
Yeah. So with antivirals, when you see the early data, you know whether or not the drug's going to work. You don't always know if it's going to be safe or well tolerated, or maybe you have to take it 4 times a day. That's not really going to work. But you know whether or not you have an antiviral on your hands. So from the very first 3 patients when we saw monotherapy data, so we went straight into people who had a hepatitis C infection. We could watch their viral load, measure the virus in their blood every day, and you could just see it just dropping. Like, we've got a good drug on our hands. So across 6 days, it just kept dropping. And it's like, okay, I think this one's it.
Yeah.
I think it's once or twice a day. You couldn't tell the difference. So we knew we had a long-acting drug. We weren't seeing that beta phase. It's all alpha. It just kept dropping.
Yeah.
We saw patients go to undetectable in days.
That's incredible.
So we got excited quickly. Yeah. We also, as soon as we started doing some of the combination studies with interferon, at the time you had to do everything on top of the standard of care.
Right.
FDA insisted every study in the U.S., you could go for about a week monotherapy, but anything longer than that, you had to combine with interferon. And what we saw with that, again, those viral loads were dropping, but we had also started doing some work with an academic collaboration. So we had some additional data on those patients that told us that it wasn't the interferon that was driving their response. So we had some patients who had the interferon gene that said you're going to be a super responder, some that had the wrong gene, you're never going to respond to interferon, and that alpha phase was the same for both of them. So that's when we realized you don't need interferon at all. And that had been the holy grail, was to get away from interferon, to not need anything that affected the immune system. But as I said, the FDA didn't want any studies done without interferon. So we made the hard decision to go outside the U.S.
So that's interesting, because there's another company that I've talked to where they had to make a similar decision, that something was going on here in the U.S. and they decided to go internationally. Is that tricky for a early stage company? Does it, I don't want to say ruin relationships with the agency?
It depends on why you're going. If they have a safety concern and you want to go outside the U.S. because you don't agree with them, that can damage some relationships. If it's we insist that you add on to standard of care, that's not going to ruin your relationship necessarily. So we did the study, the electron study in New Zealand, We ended up doing a ton of studies there. There was a joke that we cured everybody on both islands of hepatitis C. Right. Had to move on to the sheep. Just kidding. But that we treated everybody who had hepatitis C there. They were phenomenal to work with. There was a big earthquake in the middle of one of our studies that made it tough for the patients to get in. So they literally walked to people's houses to make sure they got their next dose. Bottle, the next week of this experimental therapy. Nobody missed a dose. It was great. When we presented the data, though, at the next liver conference, one of the U.S. investigators asked the FDA, why did this company have to go outside the U.S. to get this study done for a U.S. company, a U.S. drug, to have to go all the way to New Zealand? So we worked through it.
Yeah, right. In the end,
once the data were published, we were able to do all of our subsequent studies in the U.S.
So you report your phase 2 study, and you're approached by Gilead to acquire the company, to acquire Pharmasset for over $11 billion. It's a 90% premium to the stock price, and the stock price that had already gone up 300%, in the last year. Did you want to sell?
I didn't, but it was my baby.
I know,
I
right.
get it. I felt like I had worked, through HIV and the other viruses at GSK and was really ready to take this one all the way across the finish line. And so, of course, I was disappointed. We had, as I said, a very streamlined development program, a way that we could get on the market, start getting some commercial revenues to pay for the rest of the development program. So it would have been a very limited initial indication. We had, I think, 3 phase 3 studies started at that point.
Okay.
I think they ended up running 36. So just the order of magnitude of what they were able to do. And again, really challenge what this drug could do. And we saw cure after cure after cure to a point that the FDA actually allowed them to use the word cure in the marketing. I didn't think we would ever see that. Yeah. I knew it was a cure, but didn't think that would make it into marketing. Very exciting. And it warms my heart every time I meet someone whose life was changed. Yeah. They are cured of a virus they thought would lead them to an early death. So it made a big difference in hundreds of thousands, probably millions now in people's lives.
So as you reflect on this chapter in particular, was it just the drug, or was there something else that made this so successful? I mean, I hate to say almost perfect in many ways.
There's not many times you see perfect chemistry, but Mike Sophia, who was our head chemist, we had a great working relationship. I remember sitting in his office, Mike, Sophia, Bill, and me, and talking about what the perfect nucleotide would be. Mm-hmm. Long half-life, high barrier to resistance, less likely to hit any of the other targets in the body. And we could develop that, could design that molecule, but getting it into the cell, that was the secret sauce. And that's what Mike was able to come up with, was a prodrug to be able to deliver that compound into the cell, and then it became activated inside the liver cell. So you really didn't have active drug anywhere except exactly where you needed it to be. It was perfect chemistry.
That's incredible.
Yeah. And that doesn't come along more than once in a career, for sure.
Yeah.
It was a little sad to not be able to get it across the finish line, but I was proud of the work that we all did together.
You absolutely should be. Well, there's another reason why Pharmasset had a fairy tale ending too. Do you want to talk about that?
The investor relations guy?
Yeah,
I think
you might still be in touch with him.
Yeah. So I did a lot of traveling those last couple of years with the CEO and the IR guy who came to join us in, I think, second half of 2008. Really just a good friendship. He made me laugh every single day. And by the time Gilead, by the time that deal closed, we were engaged.
It's so wonderful.
Yes, it was my Disney fairy tale for sure.
So, it really, that is, you couldn't end a story on a better note by falling in love.
Yes.
And watching your baby get acquired and save so many lives. Just perfect.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we move on to the next chapter.
Unfortunately, is not a great way to talk about that relationship.
No, the relationship was fantastic.
That's still going great.
That is still good.
Right.
We love Richard.
Yes,
we love
we
Richard. So chimerics.
Yeah.
So this is the next 7 years, 2012 to about 2019. In many ways, I think about you're going into it with another drug. And if I'm correct on this, it had actually already been used in almost 500 patients on what's called a compassionate use program. Yeah. And so there was definitely, this was a pretty potent, drug. And so to me, it seems like you might be going in there and you could get a second win.
Yeah.
Right? Like all the signs are pointing towards this is a rinse and repeat of Pharmasset. So you join, and maybe shortly thereafter, there's this frenzy, a media frenzy of a little boy named Josh Hardy. Can you talk about that, what happened, and what you and the company got caught up in?
Yeah. Yeah. So this was sort of the beginning of social media. Twitter was just beginning to be one of those places where your mom gets an email, there's this little boy and the mean company is not allowing them to get the drug and he's going to die if they don't. So that very quickly turned into a big media disaster for us.
So Josh Hardy, so first I should have stopped. I'm not going to pronounce this right. Brincidovir?
We call it Brincy.
Brincy. I'll stick with that.
So brincidofovir was already in development for smallpox. Mm-hmm. We don't have smallpox anymore. Why are we developing a drug for smallpox? There is still opportunities to work with the U.S. government to develop medical countermeasures in the event that we ever were attacked using a smallpox-like weapon. We need to have something besides vaccines because we don't vaccinate folks anymore. Yeah. I'm old enough to have a smallpox vaccine. We vaccinate our military. But starting in the early 1970s, we didn't vaccinate folks anymore. We had eradicated the virus worldwide. But along the way, it was realized that it worked for all the double-stranded DNA viruses, so all the herpes viruses. So there are 8. So that's CMV, it's herpes 1 and 2. So a lot of the viruses, chickenpox, that you may not think of them as herpes viruses, but the drug works for all of those viruses. Also, interestingly, works for adenovirus, which causes the common cold. It doesn't cause a problem for most of us, but if you don't have an immune system, like after a stem cell transplant, especially children, it can be fatal. How do we know this drug is safe in humans? So the FDA had said, why don't you do a compassionate use study for whoever has one of these viruses that we know it works for, just collect the safety data. And we can understand what the safety profile is. It's pretty short use. We could also develop it for prevention of viruses that reactivate after stem cell transplants, treating adenovirus, treating CMV, some of these viruses that occur when you're severely immunocompromised. Very small patient population. So we were moving along there. There had never been a drug for adenovirus. So we had been trying to work with the FDA to come up with a clinical trial design for adenovirus. And that kept causing problems because you don't want to give little kids placebo who are dying of an adenovirus infection when we had a good bit of evidence at that point that the drug worked. So that was where the Josh Hardy situation came up. They had, at that institution, had already used Brincy. One of the physicians mentioned to the family the drug had been used in adenovirus. They called us. We said, we're no longer running that program. They called the FDA. The FDA gets phone calls literally every day about this drug and potential uses. And I started getting phone calls from the FDA commissioner saying, you are going to give this child the drug.
Yeah.
And I said, I would love to be able to enroll this child and all the others we get phone calls about into a clinical trial so we can actually get the drug approved for adenovirus. She said, fine, but right now, today, I need you to start the child on the drug. And I said, why don't I put a protocol on your desk tomorrow morning? And we get to, she's like, you can't give me a protocol tomorrow morning. Like, I can get you a protocol synopsis.
You pulled an all-nighter.
So I pulled an all-nighter and got them a protocol. He was the first patient enrolled in that study. And we went on to run a couple of studies in adenovirus. Continues to have difficulty. And again, you need randomized controlled data. And that's almost nearly impossible to do in children who have a fatal outcome. It was just a perfect storm about adenovirus.
Social media.
We did social media. Over 80,000 tweets in the first weekend.
Big bad company is
I was
killing
away with my kids on spring break, of course, and spending all night
in the
writing
hotel,
a protocol. So not ideal, but we did end up getting to run a couple of those studies and had a good couple of conversations with his family through all that. You know, it's not often you get leverage with the FDA to say we need a protocol. Here's a proposal. Happy to have that conversation. But it was one of many conversations about some of the difficult patients situations that we ran into with that program.
Yeah. It's a balance, right, between compassionate use versus the rigor of the scientific and clinical process.
Because at the end of the day, you can't, especially in such a sick patient population, you need to know, is this side effect that we're seeing related to the drug? Mm-hmm. Or is it part of what we're seeing in people who aren't getting the drug who are undergoing stem cell transplants? Right. It was one of the hardest times. We had the FBI come in. We were getting death threats. It was heartbreaking. Yeah. It was just heartbreaking. And the drug worked. Right. That was the difficult. That was a difficult time. And
so after the media frenzy, after you got Josh the drug, you became the CEO.
Yes.
The chairman of the board calls you.
Yeah. So at the time, and I had worked closely with the board already. Obviously, it was a clinical stage company. There was a lot that we were trying to keep them abreast of. They were getting phone calls, go on the website. It's easy to find board members.
Sure.
There are people with connections. And so they were getting phone calls. So I think they felt it was important to have the face of the company be a physician at that point to go forward. So, it was sort of a field promotion. I hadn't given a lot of thought to what I would do if I were CEO. It wasn't a job I was gunning for. It just happened on Sunday. I was named on Tuesday.
There you go. So you had 2 days.
I had two days to not sleep. And there's a theme here. There's not a lot of sleep in biotech.
So you weren't really expecting a CEO role. And as you got into it, did you notice a big difference? What did the CEO role entail that was obviously pretty different than a chief medical officer role?
Yeah, it was. And my number one goal was to hire a chief medical officer, to not try to do both jobs for long. So thankfully was able to hire someone who I had trained right behind me at UW, came to GSK right before I left there, had been at GSK for almost 10 years. So he came over to Chimerix and was wonderful. Also somebody I already knew and had a relationship with. Also had great support with all my other fellow executives on the team. So that was another just great team. We all had a lot of respect for each other's skills that we brought. Had a really good relationship with the CFO, who was, Price Waterhouse. Like our Venn diagrams didn't overlap much.
Everybody had their lane.
All. Everybody had their lane, and everybody just, put their hat on and let's go to work. Also had a a great support from the board chair who, when he was in town, every Monday, he'd come over, we'd have lunch. Hey, kiddo, get me my turkey on rye with mustard every Monday.
You gotta love habits.
Yeah, yep. But he was super supportive and really helped me. Yes, that's the right decision. That's the way to carry it forward, especially with things like managing a board, things I didn't do as a CMO.
Right.
Had a lot of interaction, thankfully, with our investors, being companies that were very science-based. So I had really been probably doing 90% of the investor work anyway. So that part was a little easier. Thinking about the long-term strategy for the company. Okay, do we raise now? Do we raise later? Raise when you can. Learned that one early. And as Berrey was moving into phase 3, starting to prepare for market access and market prep, building the market that didn't exist. There wasn't a drug for CMV prevention or a multiviral agent. So a lot of work there. So there were a lot of new learnings, but, as somebody likes to think of myself as a lifetime learner, there was a lot to learn, pretty steep learning curve initially, but loved it. And again, the joys of working with a team you really enjoy.
Well, talking about steep learning curve and capital raising, I think 6 months later, you had a similar sort of issue with Ebola. And in the midst of that, Berrey was thought to be, the curative drug, if you will. You also raised capital at that time.
Yeah, we had an opportunity. They were just beginning to explore, as we saw years later with COVID, can we repurpose some of the drugs that already have a lot of the history, a lot of the safety already known, drug interactions, things that we can see if they work. And there was some early evidence that it worked for Ebola. We didn't run those trials. Right. So we were raising really for our CMV clinical trials, but we did provide the drug to Doctors Without Borders, who were running the trial with a group out of Oxford University. We provided the drug there. We did provide the drug to every person who came back into the U.S. Again, worked very closely with the FDA on this. The division director for the antivirals division, she and I were on speed dial. Wasn't unusual to be having a call at 2 a.m. Yeah. I hear there's somebody just landed in New York who's been diagnosed with Ebola. Yep, we've got Berrey on the train on the way up.
I'm sensing a repeated pattern of these non-standard interactions with the FDA.
Yeah, but I think, honestly, having worked with them in the 90s during HIV, there was a lot of that camaraderie already built in. Like, we're doing everything we can to get drugs developed as quickly as possible. This isn't hair loss. It's not cosmetic drugs we're talking about here. These are serious, life-threatening illnesses, and we need to do everything we can to get the drugs as quickly as possible into the hands of the people who need them. And they were just as committed to that. So there was a little, back and forth in urgent situations. It was important for us to find a way. It's also important to realize that when there is a clinical trial that's enrolling, that's the best place for a patient to get access to the drug, because that's where you're going to get the data that eventually will allow you to approve the drug for marketing, because you'll have enough data in a controlled environment. The compassionate use, and I really don't like that term because it sounds like anything that's not allowed is not compassionate. Right. It's really expanded use. Yes. It's outside of a development program. Yeah. But you're not really getting any information. You don't have a way to collect the data. You, most of the time, never find out an outcome unless the clinician writes it up.
You had a readout for your phase 3 study, the Suppress trial. This is for Berrey in that CMV infection. It was December 15, 2015. It didn't hit statistical significance. And
not only that, it was a worse outcome for the patients who were randomized to the drug than those who were on placebo.
They had higher mortality.
It had a higher, not statistically significant, but what does statistics matter when you're talking about lives? It was a higher number of fatal outcomes in patients who were randomized to the drug, which is, there's nothing more devastating than that. It was just, we could not figure out why this happened in a drug that we knew worked. It was an effective antiviral. We didn't see this in the phase 2. And interestingly, when we looked site by site, and actually those sites that had participated in phase 2 and understood how to use the drug, we didn't see that higher mortality there. So it was really a protocol issue. The drug had very well-known side effects that got misinterpreted. The way that they managed those side effects resulted in them adding more steroids, more immune suppression, and that they ended up with more CMV, more other viral infections, more fungal infections. So it took us a few weeks, just literally 24 hours a day trying to dig through the data and understand what happened. But it was devastating. Our stock fell 90%. We were as shocked as any of our investors. So had to try to figure out whether to try again. And I thought, this is just, it's too complicated to treat for that long. So could we use the drug for a shorter period of time? We don't have to deal with those side effects in that short treatment period. So Wyatt got approved for smallpox. It's only 2 weeks of therapy. You don't have to deal with that. At the end of the day, we'd raised a lot of money to get ready for commercialization in case the trial read out as we all expected it to. And the company decided to go a different direction that wasn't in my expertise, so left the company in January 2019.
That must have been tough.
It was a hard time. It was, as I've said, drugs fail. You want them to fail fast and early, not after phase 3, and just horrible outcomes for those families, for our employees. We let go of about a third of our employees at the time. So it was a rough time. Had to kind of take a step back and, not define yourself by your most recent experience. But that took a little while. And then there was a pandemic.
Well, somebody did say to me that they had to remind you that the drug is not you.
Don't take it personally.
I like, just like at Pharmasset, when you're like, that's your baby. You know, in some ways.
It's tough. You've invested so much in it through the years. And, you want the best. You want to work so close. I'm still good friends with a lot of those clinicians. And they were so excited about the potential for the drug. It is still in development, but we'll see where we'll see where it goes. You
talk about, having to take a break. But you didn't take that much of a break, because then you started consulting for Intercept Pharmaceuticals, which was around 2019. And then you, I think, joined them in 2021. I'm not a biotech investor, but I was reading about Intercept, and I was like, this is not an easy situation to come into. They had one drug already approved, and for a small, rare liver disease, non-viral liver disease. But they were going after a much bigger population, something called NASH at the time, maybe MASH today, which is like a fatty liver. But they had already received a rejection, a complete response letter. There was already questions about the efficacy and the safety. So it seemed like a little bit of a mess. But you're like, I'm going in.
I'm going in.
So
tag me. I'm it.
Right.
Put me in.
So you joined as chief medical officer in 2021. Why? Are you glutton for punishment?
I do like a challenge, but there was a lot of promise in the drug. There were still a lot of questions about how the data were analyzed the first time. There were a couple of different pathologists that were reading the liver biopsy slides. So, not a with viral diseases, you watch the amount of virus in the blood. Eventually, it goes below limit of detection. And in the case of hepatitis C, it's gone.
Right.
It's gone for 12 weeks. You're cured. That's it. Done. Easy outcome.
Right.
Liver, not as easy when you're talking about a progressive immune-mediated. We have to rely on a biopsy. Who's reading that biopsy? You're sampling 1/50,000th of the liver. So you get a little needle. It's a big needle. But you get a little biopsy that then is dependent on whoever the pathologist is reading it. So it was not as straightforward. And there was an opportunity for us to say, okay, how can we pull in those parameters and have either quantify something or have the same pathologist read every one of these thousands of patients of multiple biopsies. Thousands of patients. Wow. So that took about a year to reread all of those, reanalyze everything. Again, not a straightforward scenario, and it would have been the first drug approved for NASH. Yeah. So there were a lot of questions. It was a great learning experience for all of us, reanalyzing all the data. We went to advisory committee.
That doesn't sound like it was very fun.
It was not a pleasant experience.
So for our listeners, you go to the FDA advisory committee where they vote on whether this drug is approvable. And going into it, they're already...
The odds were not in our favor, needless to say. This was before we were betting on such things.
Right, exactly, before the poly market.
Betting on the stock market. But it was not a great experience. Advisory committees are fraught. And this one was particularly complicated. So you have people who were experts in liver disease, but not necessarily this, or had at least never done a clinical trial with this particular indication. Either way, it was a pretty slam dunk no on that.
Yeah.
Shut the program down, refocused back to the original indication and started focusing on some of the earlier compounds to try to bring those forward. Yeah. So I wouldn't change anything about the way we approached it. Had a great experience with the team. Everybody put their heart and soul into it.
And ultimately it was sold to an Italy-based company. Mm-hmm. And you decided to step away.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They were looking for a new R&D engine for them. And hopefully that, some of those early stage compounds that we had the pleasure of working on and getting into the clinic. Yeah. We're moving forward.
So today, you're on a couple boards. Mm-hmm. You're still very much involved in the biotech industry in terms of groups, the community. As you sit and reflect on your career and the various chapters, that each one seemingly very different, what advice do you give to teams, biotech teams, to say this is what you need to get a drug across the finish line? What advice would you give to some of those smaller companies?
I think if you have a drug that you 100% believe in and can build a team of believers who are willing to also be skeptical, you've got to stress the compound. When it tells you it can do something, test it. Push it to its limits. Find out what its limits are.
You said pay attention to the outliers.
Pay attention to the outliers. When we got the phase 2 data on sofosbuvir and we had 100% cure, this was a failure. We don't know who the drug doesn't work in. Mm. So we started a study with Henry Masur at NIH and said, I need you to find some patients who you would never think about treating. And test it. And he would call me, are you sure you want me to? Yes, we need to figure out who the drug doesn't work in. Do we need to use a bigger dose or a lower dose? Or again, look for those outliers so you can really test it. And having people who are really look at the data, believe the data when it tells you what it's doing. One of the hardest things, thinking back to Brincy and our CMV trial, is we were in the analog days where you were waiting on paper to come in and analyses. And I really believe if we had a dashboard where we had real-time data and could see what was happening in real time, that could have gone to our DMC. They could have, our safety, independent safety board could have been looking at the data, and we could have made tweaks to the protocol, could have seen what was going on, hopefully could have intervened at a point before the patients were being put on immune modulators and steroids. And I think it would have made a difference having the data in real time.
Yeah.
But really, it's having people who you have faith in, a team that you enjoy working with. Yeah. And I think when you're passionate about it and about a compound and what you believe in, that's infectious. Pardon. But your investors will see how passionate you are about it, and it'll get there.
Yeah. Do you think you're done? Do you think you would take another chief medical officer role or CEO
I'm enjoying retirement. Richard thinks it's a sabbatical, but we will see.
Richard knows you best.
He does. But I'm enjoying being on boards, and again, sort of more of the public health side. Enjoy working with some of our startups in the RTP area. We had a lot of great university spin-outs, and the North Carolina Biotech Center there works with a lot of our university spin-outs. So really enjoying that. Doing some work with mentoring young women scientists.
Which we need more of.
Which we need to keep women in science and keep them, especially through those early years where it's tough to be a young mom and scientist and trying to stay on the career ladder. So it's tough times, but hopefully we can encourage young women to hang in there.
That's right. Yeah. It is worth it on the other side.
Yes.
Well, Michelle, first of all, I have to say that I think as an MD and MPH, your background was so suited to be at Pharmasset and Chimerix and Intercept, right? No better person that can understand the science and the clinical development, but also understand the public health ramifications of the decisions that you were making, and to interact with the FDA, which is really incredible.
It was luck, when the door closes in your face and you find another opportunity. There's always another opportunity around the corner.
Right.
So
what I've appreciated about your story is you don't shy away from the challenge. And that challenge has, again, you could look at Pharmasset and it's like this fairy tale story, but at the same time, you look at the next two chapters and you embrace them head on. The last thing I would say is, as a physician, you always put the patient first. And I think that's incredible too. Patient safety is always at the front. So thank you, Michelle.
Thank you.
This has been a great conversation.
Thanks for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
I know. I love this.
It's been fun to reflect back on all the chapters, the good and the bad, and the ugly.
That's right. Well, hopefully our listeners will learn from your wisdom. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.